Shalom. Thank you for inviting me to your synagogue to tell my story as the Prodigal Son. You know, this is a large room. It reminds me of the banquet hall in my father's ranch, because it took a large room to be able to seat 200 people that the fatted calf would have served. And only a wealthy man would have had such a large banquet hall. Let me tell you about my father's estate, which could best be described as a ranch in your southwest, kind of like Bonanza in the Ponderosa. We were under the laws of Moses and what we would call the Hebrew Scripture, or what you Gentiles would call the Old Testament. The laws of Moses dictated to us every aspect of our living. Everybody had rights and everybody had responsibilities. And it really affected the way we lived. For example, the crops would be rotated and they would lay furrow for a year, the seventh year, so there was an abundance. Our meat was cooked thoroughly, so there was no blood in it. And if there was no blood in it, there was no parasites. So we were a lot healthier than the Gentiles. If things were so good in my father's estate, then why did I leave? Well, why did Adam and Eve drop out of the Garden of Eden? I was about 16 at the time, and like a typical 16-year-old, I knew everything, wanted to make my own decisions, knew more than my father, and thought I could just go out and conquer the world. So I told him, Father, why I want my inheritance now. Now, at that time, the only way for a son to get his share of the inheritance was for his father to be dead. So basically I was saying to my father, I wish you were dead. If he was a typical Roman patriarch, he just would have had him executed right then and there. If he was a typical Hebrew patriarch, he wouldn't have been that extreme, but I would have, as you would say in your time, dissed him. He would have slapped me and said, as far as I'm concerned, you're dead. And that would have been the end of contact and the relationship. Now, very fortunately for me, my father was not a typical Roman or Hebrew patriarch. So he gave in to my request. In order for me to get my share of the inheritance, he had to, what you call, liquidate some of his assets by selling it. And as you can imagine, that here was a healthy man in his prime selling off property, so it just caused a scandal. And because of this, and I realized this, once I got my inherited, I would have to just clear out of there, because people would think of me as a spoiled, demanding, bratty youth. Maybe and they would have been right. So I got my inheritance and was determined to put as much distance between myself and my father's ranch as fast as I could. So out I went with my money, well-dressed, 16, knowing everything about the world. Of course, I really knew almost nothing about the Gentile world I was about to enter. At that time, the whole known world was under the Roman Empire. So we were all colonized. The Roman Empire was policed by the centurions. They were just, and they administered justice fairly and swiftly. So I wasn't really in danger of being mugged, or at least probably less so than you would be in your town, in your time. But the centurions, being agents of the Roman Empire, did not have lofty concepts of the dignity and the worth of the individual. They didn't have the concept of justice and trying to protect the vulnerable from predators. These concepts are American, and you got them from us because of our belief in the God of Abraham and Sarah. Of course, we got them from Scripture. The Roman gods of Zeus and so on were gods of strength and power and really didn't care about the individual. So here I was, 16, just strutting about with no real plans except I would conquer the world. There are places that my father had warned me about, just as for thousands of years young men and women are warned about to stay away from. As today in your time and 2,000 years ago, generals would warn their soldiers, captains would warn their sea crew, keep away from certain establishments. And the sailors and the soldiers would say, the old man is just trying to keep us young bucks from having fun. But they would learn from experience, no, the old men knew what they were talking about. My brother said, I squandered my inheritance on prostitutes and sinful living. Well, that's what he said. But the Gospel says that I squandered it on foolish or stupid living. I'll just give you one example of many. I was lonely. There'd be a tavern with music and people were seeming to laugh and sing and have fun. They would beckon me to come in. I would come in. I think this place was full of joy and promise. Fast forward a few hours, I would leave without a good chunk of my money and with less confidence in my judgment. And this would keep happening. And I would just keep walking and figuring out I really didn't have that many job skills. And finally, at one point, when I was in a distant Gentile land, I had reached the point what you would call I was down and out. My once clean, beautiful clothes were now rags. I was completely out of money and was going to starve to death. So, out of desperation, I just knocked on a door of a Gentile pig farmer. I had nothing to lose, and I said, I will work for food. In this case, I really meant it. And they believed me. Whether they took me in out of pity or exploitation, I don't really know. It doesn't really make any difference. What they told me was, we have nothing to offer you except you can help care for our pigs, and you can sleep where they sleep and eat where they eat.